This video is sponsored by Only Crits. A while back, I made a video about why I don't feel the need to ban spells in my 5th edition D&D games. And in that video, I went through a bunch of spells from the 2014 version of the game that a lot of tables ban, and I explained why banning those spells might be a good call. And then I told you why I don't ban those spells. And today I want to tell you a story from one of my games which I think will help highlight why I don't ban spells, or rather, why I don't feel that banning spells is usually the right approach for my games. This doesn't mean that you should never feel like you can ban spells if they're becoming a problem. But personally, I view any troubling spell as a problem to solve. If the spell is being abused by one player in particular, okay, sure, might be time to have a talk with that player. But what if the player's just using the spells exactly how they're supposed to be used, but the spells are causing problems at the table? What if the spells are just making the fights so much easier than you want, and that's sucking the tension out of all your combat encounters? That was the problem I was dealing with back when I ran my Princes of the Apocalypse game in 2018. And the party's over-reliance on a few very powerful spells made me completely rethink the way I was approaching combat encounters for that group. And that's what we're talking about today. Before we get into today's story, I should say, happy belated American Thanksgiving. I celebrated it a bit late. My parents came to visit us on Saturday, and we had a lovely time. And sure, the origin of the holiday is mired in some really ugly history that followed that first Thanksgiving, and if we're honest, some of that horrible stuff happened within my lifetime. This stuff is not just ancient history. But that being said, we can and should acknowledge all of that, and grieve for the native people who suffered in countless ways, while still taking advantage of the free time off our companies give us and taking the time to let our friends and family know how much we care about them. Plus, we can watch the Thanksgiving episodes of Friends, which are usually among the best episodes of the show. The episode with the trifle is gold. It's so good. So I want to let you know how thankful I am for you. This year has been pretty chaotic, and I have a lot of fantastic plans for next year, but that's also going to be kind of a lot. But frankly, none of that would be possible without the support of my viewers. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you for subscribing. I also especially want to thank my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. You have literally carried me through a really tough few months, and I am enormously grateful. So in the spirit of what this holiday should represent, and divorced from the weird propaganda around its origin, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. And now, on with the show. The party of my Princes of the Apocalypse campaign was made up of 4 characters: Alia the Air Genasi, Bixby the Ghostwise Halfling, Cade Ironbark the Dwarf and Wereboar, and Ribbit the human teenager who was kind of like a little sociopathic Peter Pan. And if you're wondering why I didn't just tell you what classes these characters were, it's not because I recently put out a video suggesting maybe we don't tell each other our character classes and we let our characters instead be defined by other traits. No, it's actually because all 4 of these characters were druids. I ran an entire campaign where all 4 player characters were druids for almost the entire campaign. If I remember correctly, Alia the Air Genasi was Circle of Dreams, Bixby the Halfling was Circle of the Moon, Cade the Dwarf was Circle of the Shepherd, and Ribbit the Teen was Circle of the Land. And let me tell you, running games for 4 druids, 4 prepared casters who can also transform into animals, is like running with weights on your arms and legs. It's a challenge in the truest sense of the word. Now, in a later game with the same group, when all of us played bards for a short time, our GM had us do a draft. We would specifically choose spells that the other players would then not be able to pick. It was a smart decision, especially because bards are not prepared casters. No matter how many times I've said otherwise, because I keep forgetting that the proposed rule change that allows bards to change their spells on a long rest didn't actually make the jump from Unearthed Arcana to Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. It has taken me so long to unlearn that mistake. But we didn't have that same rule for the druids, and in fact I'm not even sure that we would have done that even if we'd already played in the Bard campaign and done the draft, since part of the fun of playing a druid is being able to choose new spells to suit any given situation. However, especially in what was essentially the second act of the campaign, the party started heavily relying on 2 spells: Conjure Animals and Healing Spirit. Now, I believe Cade was usually the character to pack Healing Spirit. I don't remember that being cast by everybody. Quite frankly, not everybody needed to prepare that spell, because not only was it the overly powerful version that was originally published, and not only were we interpreting the rules wrong, so the players got double healing whenever they used it, but also, the players were barely taking any damage. They emerged from every encounter almost entirely unscathed thanks to 3 factors: temporary hit points from Cade's summoned bear spirits, bonus hit points from their wild shapes, and a very liberal casting of Conjure Animals. The party loved to cast Conjure Animals. And again, this was the 2014 version of the spell, where you could summon 8 velociraptors. And yes, my players could summon dinosaurs. In fact, when they were in a big city in the Desran Valley, I introduced an eccentric animal collector who, as payment for a job well done, specifically gave them access to velociraptors so they could study them and summon them or transform into them. Because come on, you could not summon dinosaurs in any game. If my players wanted to summon dinosaurs, I didn't honestly see a problem with that. And that should probably tell you a lot about my mindset when I run games, you know? Still, even with that focus on putting the player's fun front and center, there are still a lot of really good reasons why people ban conjure animals, and I discussed that in my video about banning spells. First of all, it slows down play. Suddenly, the entire party has to wait longer than usual because Frank has to roll attacks for 8 wolves, all of whom have advantage thanks to pack tactics. But that wasn't really a big issue for us. Because first of all, we were all playing digitally, so rolling 16 attack rolls took less than 16 seconds. But second, when everybody was conjuring animals, nobody really minded that much when one of the other players did so. Sure, not everybody cast it in every combat, and even if they didn't all summon 8 creatures every time. But all of them could. And maybe some of my players will watch this and think, actually, I did get annoyed whenever the other players cast 8 wolves or 8 bloodhawks or 8 velociraptors, and fair enough, it can be hard to read your fellow players' emotions when you're playing virtually. But the point is, I don't remember any players ever voicing any frustration about the number of critters taking up turns in initiative. Because they could all do that. The second reason a lot of groups ban conjure animals is just because it's way too much to keep track of. Having all these creatures on the board is a huge pain in the ass. Now, we were playing virtually, so I didn't need to bring miniatures for every kind of creature my party might summon, but I still had to create tokens for them. And I was actually trying to run a Theater of the Mind game, in part because I was running a game for 4 druids, and I didn't want to deal with all the tokens for wild shapes and summoned animals and spell effects and so on. But my players weren't really going for it. Now, that was true even outside of whether or not they summoned creatures. It was just becoming clear as the campaign went on that my players just always wanted a battle map. They were struggling to follow my narration, and while I wanted to stick with a Theater of the Mind game to further hone my narration skills and get better at running those sorts of games, that wasn't fair to my players who were struggling to follow along when I set scenes and ran combat encounters. Now, at the time, Prince of the Apocalypse wasn't for sale through Roll20's online store as a pre-generated campaign, so if I wanted a battle map, I either had to take a lot of time to prep maps in advance, or I just had to get a lot better at whipping up my maps for my players on the fly. And sure, that was quite an adjustment for me, but that's the game my players wanted to play. Obviously, I wish I'd known that before I started running the game and agreed to run a campaign for 4 druids when I couldn't get a map pack for it through the website we were using to run the games. I probably would have switched to Curse of Strahd or something, or gone fully homebrew, so I didn't have to worry about trying to recreate the specific maps from the campaign. But obviously, that's the sort of pre-game communication I've gotten a lot better at handling before committing to a campaign. And in fact, you could argue that it was a blessing in disguise to feel untethered from the encounters in the book, since my players were way too powerful for those anyway. Which of course brings me to the third reason people tend to ban conjure animals. It just made all of these fights trivially easy. Having to come up with maps and tokens doesn't have to be a big deal, nor was it an issue for my players to roll lots of attacks. Sure, we were playing online, but I honestly don't think our players would have minded that much even if we'd been playing in person. Especially if they'd gotten all their dice from today's sponsor, Only Crits. Only Crits produces absolutely incredible dice that I've been using for a few years now, and I just really love them. They've got such fantastic designs, you can absolutely get lost in their inventory and spend all day browsing and debating which set you want to buy. Do I want the sharp edge dice that look like they have galaxies inside of them? The gemstone dice that sound like the most satisfying click-clack math rocks? The hollow metal dice? Or the dice that say fuck me when you roll a 1? I just can't decide. But also, I don't have to decide. Because today is the last day of Only Crits' Black Friday Cyber Monday deal. You can buy 2 dice sets and get the 3rd set for free, and you'll also get an Only Crits dice tray for free. You can also order a $200 gift card for only $150, which means you can basically get a bonus $50 that you can spend on Only Crits in the future, basically for free. Or you could give that gift card to a friend in the spirit of the season. And if you still just can't decide what kind of dice to get, that's okay, because Only Crits can be your Secret Santa if you order the Only Crits Mystery Box, and you'll get 35% off your Mystery Box order if you use the promo code MysteryBox35. And you can get all those discounts if you visit the website in the description. That's an affiliate link, so if you go through that link, it'll let Only Crits know I sent you, which helps me out a lot. Plus, you get some amazing dice. Once again, today, Monday, December 2nd, is the last day of the sale, so go get your dice now for the best deal possible. And thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. The perfect example of how easy combat had become for my group came when the party was escorting a caravan through the valley, and they were attacked by a pair of hill giants. Now, in the book, all the encounters on the road were things like bandit attacks, and I didn't think those were very interesting, but I definitely knew those fights were not going to pose any sort of challenge to my party. And I needed to test my players' limits and see what they could actually handle. So rather than trying to buff up the bandits with new stat blocks, I rolled up a few random encounters appropriate for 4 5th level characters of varying levels of difficulty. On the first day of the caravan, 2 hill giants charged at the party, and this was the easiest encounter I'd prepared. However, it turned out to be even easier than I expected, and this had nothing to do with how balanced the encounter was or was not. it had to do with the placement of the monsters. Because the giants emerged from over a hill and then they charged at the caravan. Sure, they could have just thrown boulders at the party, but then the party would have just summoned a bunch of creatures around the giants far away from them. And I wanted the giants to get up close with the party and try to do some damage. But because they had to close that distance, and probably because I rolled low on initiative, I don't know that for sure, but that does tend to happen a lot, the party actually had time to summon a bunch of animals between them and the giants. So as the giants tried to close that distance, they were instead met with a giant boar, 2 direwolves, and 8 velociraptors. The giants didn't stand a chance. However, like I said, by the time this session rolled around, I was in the process of trying to figure out just what I needed to do in order to challenge the party. Clearly, just throwing a few huge bags of hit points at them was not the solution. But fortunately, that wasn't the only encounter I'd prepared for that session. So when the party rested for the night, they were sharing one room at the inn, like the hobbits in their beds in the Prancing Pony. And they were being vigilant, one of them was keeping watch, so one of them was awake when some enemies broke into their room to ambush them during the night. Specifically, the party was attacked by 2 hobgoblin ninjas that broke in through the window, a bearded devil who busted through the door to flank the party, and a human spellcaster poking his head in from the hallway. And that was the end of the session, but this was a very deliberate technique I'd picked up from an episode of Critical Role that we'll talk about early next year. Actually, something that Matt Mercer does quite a lot. I made sure to introduce all of the enemies at the end of the session, so my players would know that whatever monsters they were about to fight had already been determined. AKA, they would know that I wasn't changing any of the math in between sessions by adding some of these enemies, since they saw all of them at the end of the previous session. And showing them all the enemies at the end of a session also gives the players a chance to strategize in between games. Sure, the goal was to catch them flat-footed, but I also wanted them to feel like I was playing fair with them. They simply wouldn't get a full round of preparation like they did with the hill giants and so many other enemies. But my goal wasn't just to annihilate them. Setting the fight in a very small room was also very deliberate. It limited the number of creatures that could be summoned. I mean, not by that much, because at this point in the campaign I didn't care too deeply about whether or not things fit in the squares or not. Roll20 was a little bit too janky to really worry about that level of tactical granularity. But certainly it made it more challenging to fill the room with direwolves. So when we picked up the fight in the next session, at the top of initiative, Alia the Air Genasi did something incredibly clever. She cast Fog Cloud in the room. This effectively blinded everyone in the room, granting advantage to attack them, but imposing disadvantage on those attacks, making it a wash. Then Ribbit, the creepy little boy, hid under a bed and conjured 2 giant snakes, which each had blind sight, which negated the disadvantage from the Fog Cloud and allowed them to strike their foes with advantage. Tactically, that was brilliant. Also, the spellcaster was an illusionist, so he was effectively neutered by the Fog Cloud spell. He was safe outside the room, but unable to target anybody with his magic, so he fell back a bit and prepared to cast a spell on the first enemy he saw. Inside the room, the snakes worked on the ninjas, and our heroes rolled well enough on their concentration checks to maintain the Fog Cloud and the snakes. The bearded devil got a few vicious hits in, making it clear that this party should stay very clear of his glaive. Alia drank one of her potions of fire breath and found out the hard way that the bearded devil was totally immune to fire. The inn, however, was not, and so a small fire began to burn across the bedroom wall. Already one of those dynamic fights that I'd run at that point in the campaign. Cade, the dwarf wereboar, rushed outside to find the wizard and immediately got hit with a phantasmal killer spell, taking 4d10 psychic damage. Fortunately, Cade was able to make his second saving throw, otherwise he would have just kept taking that damage every round. Unsurprisingly, the party also used Healing Spirit during the fight, but it functioned more like it was intended by the creators, working as a piece of interesting narrative terrain that helped the party in combat. If the player characters took a lot of damage, they had to try to cross the room and get into the Healing Spirit. But they also couldn't stay in it very long or keep running through it in a circle, because it wasn't safe to stay in one place for long throughout the fight. However, the party was able to take down the foes inside the room, and they chased down the spellcaster. They found him in another room of the inn where he had taken 2 women as hostages, and was effectively using them as human shields. However, the party made a perception or investigation check, and discovered that both the wizard and one of the hostages were illusions. The real illusionist was hiding under the bed. However, he still had his hand on the woman's ankle, just like Edgar in the morgue scene in Men in Black, to keep her from running and keep her close to him. Still, the party knew where he was, they descended on him, and they messed him up pretty good, so it was pretty clear he was not going to get out of this alive. Which means when it came to his turn, I had a choice to make. I knew these individuals were working with the water cultists in the service of Olhydra, the elemental prince of water, and they came here seeking retribution on the party. That's part of why I described the ninjas as hobgoblins. I was using the stats for the Hobgoblin Iron Shadows from Volo's Guide to Monsters, but I chose not to reskin them because using hobgoblins helped foreshadow some behind-the-scenes things happening in the water cult. So the ambush was meant to punish the party for what they'd done to thwart the water cult so far. But the wizard wasn't going to survive his turn, so he wasn't going to be able to do enough damage to any of the players to mean anything. but I still wanted him to go out with a bang. So when his turn came in initiative, he glared at the party and said, "Ol Hydra reigns." And then he cast a 3rd level magic missile on the hostage, killing her instantly. Obviously, he wasn't going to survive this fight, and obviously killing that woman gains him no tactical advantage, but it's a way for him to spite the heroes. And besides, he had taken a hostage, and the players pressed the attack anyway. I had to show them what happens when you test a desperate man with nothing left to lose. There had to be a consequence for attacking someone despite the fact that he had a hostage. The bolts of magic hit the woman in the chest and killed her on the spot, and then the party ripped the wizard apart. And then they evacuated the inn since it was actively on fire. After the encounter, one of the players asked me if they should continue to expect the combats to become more challenging. And I said, yeah, probably. At the very least, my goal was to continue challenging them. Again, my goal was not to kill the party, but I did want them to feel challenged, which means I had to put my thumb on the scale a bit. It was a hard fight, but they pulled themselves out of the fire. Pun intended. And sure, this was a more dangerous encounter, but I was exploring the new encounter building rules from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. I was adjusting to the challenge of running for 4 druids. I was getting more confident using a battle map and miniatures on a virtual tabletop. So there wasn't necessarily going to be a completely linear escalation of danger. There might be spikes of difficulty, and then the challenge might level out as the players gain more power with their level ups, and so on. However, what actually made that fight more challenging had a lot less to do with the bad guys I chose, and more to do with how I deployed them. Whenever I rolled a random encounter or prepped some monsters that the party could stumble upon, but I didn't prep interesting terrain, the fights would tend to be really lackluster. However, when I took the time to more strategically prepare encounters, the way I used to do when I ran 4th edition games, then I usually wound up with something a lot more dynamic and a lot more exciting for the players. And this is actually a lesson that I think I need to relearn. When you're designing encounters in 5th edition, the math provided in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide is pretty much useless. And so it became really tempting to just say, well, then I'm not going to worry about prepping encounters. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the math of my monsters or setting up scenarios. I'm just going to pick the monsters that make sense for the environment and for the adventure, and just see what happens. And I still do feel like there's nothing wrong with not worrying about the monster math, and instead just choosing monsters that thematically serve the story. However, I think that perhaps when it comes to my own prep, sometimes I've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I've never excelled at prepping maps from my encounters, and even describing rooms is a challenge for me. But I originally revisited this story because I thought it was a helpful way to illustrate my philosophy behind why I don't ban spells. If a spell is causing issues in combat, sure, I could just ban it, or I could find a way to meet my players where they are. Acknowledge the fact that they're having fun casting that spell, and raise the level of challenge accordingly. However, this story accidentally reminded me of the fact that a lot of my encounters still lack this element of strategy. The only way I find that I really tackle these fights with this level of cunning is if I make a very deliberate effort to do so. And that's just a lot easier to do if I incorporate it into my session prep. Also, there might be a book about encounters and strategy and how to make sure it feels like the monsters want to win or that they know what they're doing, and maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later this month. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell. All of that helps the channel a lot. Support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships if you're able and willing. Your support means more than I can say. I know I talked about it at the beginning of the video, but it honestly is so true. Join my Discord server and hang out with other wonderful people and catch my updates through my newsletter. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. In this video, I mentioned that the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide has some pretty frustrating and unhelpful advice for building encounters, but that does not mean that the entire book was completely useless. Even though it does kind of seem like nobody else I know ever uses anything besides the list of magic items. So click here to watch my video where I tell you about the parts of the book that I actually do use, and think that it's maybe not a terrible book. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.